Hello and welcome to Battleground Ideas, where faith, philosophy, and culture collide. I'm Chuck Mason, and I want to welcome you to the podcast and say thank you because I know that your time is important. Today we're going to talk about critical race theory, and our episode is entitled, What is Critical Race Theory? I know it's a question on top of everybody's mind. A lot of people are asking, what is it? Where does it come from? How is it impacting culture? Who's quote unquote right here? Is the left when they say that it's not a thing and it's nowhere and it's being overblown, or the right when they say it's a danger and we have to get rid of it, we have to legislate it out? Well, as always, I'm going to take a deep dive into the ideas that led to the development of critical race theory. I'm going to show you how it's at work at culture, and then I'm going to let you decide. So let's begin. What is critical race theory? Critical race theory is a broad academic discipline, a broad school of essentially academic thought that started with a group of Harvard intellectuals like Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell Jr., Richard Delgado, who were concerned about the lagging performance in the black community when it came to performance on the SAT, entrance into college, annual income, graduation rates, incarceration rates. What they found on an ongoing basis was that the black community and other minority communities were lagging behind the white community. An example would be, every year black high school students perform at about 100 to 150 points less or worse on SATs than white students do. Now, it was a little perplexing to them because they're starting to look at this in the late 1980s. And by that time, you had 20 years of the civil rights movement, and most of the overt legalized discrimination in America was essentially eliminated. And you'd had affirmative action programs that had been in effect for decades, and those programs were designed to help boost black and minority community performance. So they asked themselves, why do the differences persist? Now, they had it's generally held that they had three different sources of influence or explanation for why these differences continue to persist. The first would have been genetic differences between the black and white community, or black and Latino community. And okay, yes, there are genetic differences, and they're going to have influence who we are as people, there's no doubt. But in terms of genetic inferiority, that blacks were somehow genetically inferior to whites, and that was driving poor performance in terms of SAT, that has been rejected out of hand completely, and there's no basis in that whatsoever. The second was cultural factors, meaning that, if a child is raised in a two-parent household, does that have an impact upon SAT scores? Well, yes, it does. So you could go down and take a look at, were kids raised in homes with books? Were kids raised in homes that had grade expectations? Were kids raised in homes that had limits on video games? Were kids raised in homes that study? All these do affect score performance on SATs and education in general. But these cultural factors were rejected by the early critical race theorists, and they set their sights on and they adopted what we would consider to be critical theory as the lens by which they interpreted why the differences in outcomes were persistent across years and across generations and across decades, particularly the decades after the civil rights movement and with the affirmative action programs in place. Now, it's the adoption of the lens of critical theory, that being the paradigm by which they interpreted what was driving the differences in outcomes and also driving what they felt needed to be remedies to change that. It's the use of critical theory, hence critical race theory, that becomes the sticking point. And in order to understand critical race theory, we have to understand critical theory. And in order to understand critical theory, we first have to understand Marxism. Now, you would ask why? Critical theory itself is simply an advancement of Marxism, in which critical theorists of the Frankfurt School attempted to expand Marx's understanding of oppression and exploitation beyond his sphere of economics. But to understand the challenges of critical race theory. We have to be able to understand critical theory, and we have to understand Marxism. Now, again, I'm not here to blow smoke on the podcast. I'm here to show you how ideas develop. Philosophy matters. Philosophy drives culture, and that's why we do faith, philosophy, and culture here. So we're going to start by taking a deep dive into the writings of Marx and into the critical theorists, to show you where the development came. And with that, well, let me say this, without this information, you really cannot come to an adequate determination of the impact that this is having on culture and why. We're going to begin with the thoughts of Karl Marx. Marx provides a complete paradigm shift for the causes of exploitation and suffering and the outcomes of human beings, how well they do or how poorly they do in society. Marx is providing a theory for the sources of suffering or thriving in any culture or society. And here's what he proposed. Marx felt that it was the way that societies were structured and ordered, the way that you built your institutions, determines everything that happens in society. Not only what people do, but in fact, their consciousness, what they thought. In Marx's mind, everything that happened in a society, not only people's actions, but even their thoughts, were conditioned and determined by the social institutions and social structures of the societies that they were influenced by on a moment-by-moment and day-to-day basis. Now, this may seem esoteric to you, but as we move forward, you will understand why this is central to understanding critical race theory. So, I'm reading from Karl Marx, a preface to Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, and he says this: the mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and intellectual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence. It is, on the contrary, their social existence which determines their consciousness. Let me break this down for you. Marx believed that the institutions of your society and its social structures created the thoughts and actions of people. It went so deeply that it fundamentally created who people were. So race and gender were even social constructs, meaning what it means to be black is not defined by the color of one person's skin, or whether you're male or female are not tied to biology. The concept of being male or female was dictated by your society, not biology. And so by extension, corrupt societies created corrupt human beings. Just societies created just human beings. Corrupt societies created corrupt thoughts in people's minds, which then created or forced them into doing corrupt actions. And the other side of the coin, just societies created just thoughts in people's minds, which led to them acting in ways of justice. This is where this is important. It is not the consciousness of men which determines their existence. It is, on the contrary, their social existence what determines their consciousness. So what he's saying here, and what he proposes, is the way that a society is structured determines its social mindset, its political mindset, and its intellectual processes. And he says directly, it is not conscious thoughts of people which determines their existence. It is, on the contrary, their social existence which determines their consciousness. So the thoughts of humanity are determined by their social existence, and that social existence is defined by the way the society is set up from its first principles. What Marx is saying is that your thoughts and your actions are created within you based upon the society and its institutions that you live under. You are essentially inescapable from or indistinguishable from the society in which you live. Good societies create good people. Bad societies create bad people. And it's not a matter of personal free will, as though someone could be a good person even though they were living within a corrupt society. For Marx and Marxists, societies controlled the outcome because they controlled and created the thoughts and actions of people. What is important to understand, and this is the battle between left and right at this point in time, is that from this perspective of the left and from critical theorists and critical race theorists, concepts like racism and racist exploitation. If an individual has a racist thought, it's not a matter of that person's free will. That racist thought had essentially been planted, had been conditioned, had been reinforced by a racist culture, a racist society, and racist societal institutions that individual had been immersed in from the beginning. I'm going to take a moment to summarize some important points as we begin to move forward towards critical theory and critical race theory. There are three important conclusions that we can draw from this that influence this journey towards critical theory and critical race theory, and that is this. For Marxism, society controls outcomes. So, social institutions construct human consciousness and characteristics. Things like gender, race, class, sexual orientation result from how people are socialized within societies. The next point is that corrupt societies create corrupt human consciousness, and that results in humans exploiting and victimizing. Corrupt societies are the source of all conflict and harm in any society. It all roots back to the way that the society and its institutions are constructed from the very beginning. And the third point is that the success or failure of a society is in the hands of its institutions. And the battles for the outcomes of humanity are waged in battles for those institutions. This is really a whole new paradigm for morality. Essentially, a battle for good and evil is waged in how you can control and how you can construct your society. And in the Marxist eyes, this truly is a battle for good and evil. In the eyes of Marxists, corrupt institutions equal murder. Now, if you think that's an overstatement, follow me. Systems and institutions, they control the formation and outcomes of society. So, corrupt institutions create exploitation and victimization, while those built upon equity bring forth societies that are utopian. Since race, class, gender, and sexual orientation are all social constructs, negative attitudes about these, racism, sexism, homophobia, and economic exploitation, are all caused by corrupt social institutions. Marxism seeks to tear down institutions that caused exploitation, replacing them with those that achieve equity. I'll break that down a little further. But when I say that institutions equal murder, I mean this. Marx actually felt that the fact that people made a profit in capitalist economies, the fact that they didn't share that profit equally amongst themselves and all the workers and everybody who contributed, that there wasn't economic equity. Marx called that wage slavery and imperialist war. And as far as he was concerned, the fact that capitalists did not distribute their profits equally, they were, in a sense, taking life from workers. And the capitalism, since it was based upon theft, was responsible for all war, famine, racism, sexism, bigotry, homophobia, rape, murder, violence, drug addiction, alcoholism, you name it. Everything negative in society came down to the structure of capitalism that allowed it to institute a form of slavery. Now, the first round of Marxists, the people who bought into Marxist philosophy, believed this, and they felt that the way to end exploitation, victimization, and suffering in the world was to break apart those societal structures and institutions that caused exploitation and oppression, because they were creating the oppressive thoughts and actions of those people in society, and to replace those institutions with ones based upon equity and social justice. The first attempts to apply the theories of Marx and achieve economic equity came through the socialist governments of the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Cuba. And in an effort to achieve equity and restorative justice, Marxists felt it was important to liquidate anyone who got in their way, who was complicit within the system. And over 100 million people died in Marxist gulags in the 20th century. This is a little-known fact of human history, but it becomes essential information for us as we understand and evaluate critical race theory and its impact on culture. I'm going to read something from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and it demonstrates what Marxism looks like when it has the opportunity to operate within a given culture and society. This is from the abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago, starting on pages 171 and 1 to 178. And Solzhenitsyn writes, "Didn't Marx and Engels teach that the old bourgeois capitalist machinery of compulsion had to be broken up and a new one created immediately in its place? And included in the machinery of compulsion were the army, the police, the courts, and the prisons. How, in establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, that is, the overthrow of capitalism, could they delay with a new type of prison? Thus we can observe that the leading idea of the archipelago of forced labor had been advanced in the first month after the October Revolution. And even while sitting peacefully among the fragrant hay mowings of Rosliv and listening to the buzzing bumblebees, Vladimir Lenin could not help but ponder the future penal system. Even then, he had worked things out and reassured us. The suppression of the minority of exploiters by the majority of the hired slaves of yesterday is a matter so comparatively easy and simple and natural that it is going to cost much less in blood, will be much cheaper for humanity than the preceding suppression of the majority by the minority. According to the estimates of the Emigre professor of statistics Kurganov, this comparatively easy internal repression cost us, from the beginning of the October Revolution up to 1959, a total of 66 million. Yes, 66 million lives. We, of course, cannot vouch for this figure, but we have none other that is official. And just as soon as the official figure is issued, the specialists can make necessary critical comparisons. Let me go down and break this down for you. This is precisely what Marx teaches and what we had just had outlined. Marx said that didn't he teach that the old capitalist machinery of compulsion, a capitalist society, had to be broken up and a new one created immediately in its place? And included in this capitalist machinery of compulsion and exploitation were the army, the police, the courts, and the prisons. These are all the societal institutions that would have been built upon corruption. For how, in establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat, could they delay with new types of prisons? Thus, we can observe that the leading edge of the archipelago of forced labor, that was the gulags, the socialist concentration camps, that they had been advanced in the first month after the October Revolution. Now, listen to what Solzhenitsyn says about Lenin. Here's Lenin sitting along a hillside in a pastoral setting on a bright sunny day amongst the fragrant hay mowings of this little country town of Rosliv, listening to bumblebees, and Lenin realizing the necessity of a concentration camp system for his Marxist socialist revolution. And listen to what Lenin wrote. He's saying, the suppression of the minority of the exploiters by the majority of the hired slaves of yesterday is a matter so comparatively easy and natural that it is going to cost much less blood and will be much cheaper for humanity than the preceding suppression of the majority by the minority. Here's what Lenin is saying. The capitalist system causes wage slavery, imperialist war, and that is murder. And in order to break this system apart, we need to tear it down and take those people who resist the revolution, who resist the change, who choose to be involved in the perpetuation of this corrupt society and its institutions. They will end up in concentration camps. And Lenin is saying, I know that they're going to die, but the number of those that die will be a pittance compared to the number that would die if they allowed their oppressive system to continue. The concentration camp system and the number of capitalist oppressors who died within them was necessary. That level of bloodshed, it will be minuscule compared to the number of people who would have died had the capitalist system allowed to continue its reign of wage slavery and imperialist war. And Solzhenitsyn provides the Soviets' own statistics. This comparatively easy internal repression, as Solzhenitsyn writes, cost us, from the beginning of the October Revolution up to 1959, a total of 66 million lives. 66 million people perished in the Soviet gulags. It's estimated that an additional 70 to 80 million died within the gulags in China during Mao's socialist Marxist revolution. In total, the minimum number of people that had been liquidated because they were deemed to be complicit in running these systems or resisting change is over 100 million people. Now, I get it. You're wondering, why are we here? Why have we gone down this road? I understand. Well, this is going to bring us to critical theory, and that's the next step that we have along the way to understanding critical race theory. Because there were a group of Marxists who followed Marx who agreed with what he wrote and agreed that the corruption of economic systems of capitalism was responsible for human carnage in societies. But they felt that Marx didn't go far enough. They felt that the exploitation, the victimization, and the oppression of a capitalist society was not limited to the economic system alone. They felt that exploitation, victimization, and oppression were built into every social structure and every institution in a Western capitalist society. And this brings us to critical theory. Critical theory, it's an advancement of Marxism developed through the Frankfurt School. Critical theorists agreed with Marx that the institutions of society were responsible for exploitation, but the sources of exploitation were not limited to economics. Critical theorists saw exploitation happening within every level of every institution of society. There are two important points about critical theory, and you will find these points becoming the backbone for critical race theory. The first was that exploitation was so embedded within societies that it was unrecognizable and people could no longer see the exploitation when they were causing. It becomes so normalized that oppressors called exploitation truth and could not see beyond their privileged advantage. And two, institutions that had embedded systemic exploitation were beyond rehabilitation and they must be broken up and replaced. Remember what we just wrote from Solzhenitsyn when he says, didn't Marx and Engels say that the capitalist system of compulsion had to be broken up and new systems put in their place? So critical theory is not only an extension of Marxism, but it's a broadening of its understanding and application and analysis to every social institution and structure within a society. Now, this is apocalyptic stuff in their mind. And I'm going to read you a quote from George Lukács from the Frankfurt School when he said, I saw the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution to the cultural contradictions of the epoch. Such a worldwide overturning of values cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of new ones by the revolutionaries. Here's the reason why I'm reading this to you. Marxist and critical theorists believe that the structures of society are responsible for everything negative. And if that is the case, then you must destroy the structures that are causing human suffering. And if it takes radical applications by radical revolutionaries to destroy corrupt societies, then the ends justify the means. I am not writing this, they are. And the history of Lenin and of Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot, amongst others, will tell us 100 million corpses later that they believe this. As we move to critical race theory, we cannot lose sight of this moving forward. I know there has been a lot of information to this point, but trust me, when we get to the end of critical race theory, you'll understand why. All of this will make sense. And with that, we are going to move to critical race theory. Now, going back to what I had said at the beginning of the podcast, when the Harvard intellectuals saw persistent gaps in performance between Black America and white America, obviously they wanted to understand why. What was leading to, or what was contributing to the fact that Black America was not performing as well as white America on so many critical factors. All statistics need interpretation. Statistics are just numbers, and interpretations required worldviews and paradigms through which we begin to make sense of our world. And as I said, the critical race theorists chose critical theory as the lens through which they were going to understand the dynamics of race in America. And they used the critical theorist lens, which said that the systems of America were set up from its very inception built upon racism, that racism was built into and factored into every level of American society, dating back to 1619 when the first African slaves arrived in America. Choosing critical theory as the interpretive lens brings with it some significant consequences for the way the theory plays out in culture. The first is that there is no other explanation for differences in outcomes between the black and white communities except for systemic institutional racism that is embedded into each and every aspect of society, its institutions, and the people of America. Critical race theory won't even entertain the possibility that cultural factors come into play. There is no other explanation for differences in outcome other than systemic racism that has been built into this country. Now, the second are the conclusions that we draw from this, which are running in lockstep with critical theorists, that racism in America has been so embedded and so habituated that it's become normalized. So for everybody who's living through what is, quote, normal, unquote, white America, they have zero awareness that they are upholding or participating in and unknowingly perpetuating systems of white supremacy and racism throughout everyday interactions of every aspect of American society and its institutions. This racism and white supremacy had become so normalized for so long that it was now completely unrecognizable. It translates into an unseen white privilege that those who benefit within the white community are completely unable to recognize. Those Harvard academics use this lens to interpret differences within the criminal justice system in America, asking, why is there a disproportionately high number of black individuals who are arrested? Why are there disproportionately high numbers of black individuals who are incarcerated? Why are there disproportionately high numbers of black individuals who receive longer sentences? And this is where critical race theory began. So it's not uncommon for people when dialoguing about critical race theory, or if somebody asks what is critical race theory, that people say it is an analysis of the legal system in the United States to see if it has been devised in such a way that privileges white people and disadvantages black. But the challenge of critical race theory is it does not remain bounded there. Critical race theorists used all of the guidance of critical theory to look at everything in America, all of the societal institutions from top to bottom, through the lens of systemic racism being embedded into every aspect and every interaction of society. It was no longer bounded to simply an analysis of the United States legal system. Critical race theorists declared that every institution, every societal system in America was built from the very beginning on the backs of systemic racism and racial oppression, and that each one of these systems were so embedded with racism and corrupt that individuals who participated and benefited couldn't recognize the racism they were perpetuating upon minorities or the privilege they were experiencing. There are three core principles I'll give you that run through the different perspectives and applications and understandings of critical race theory, and they are: number one, that differences in outcomes between different races, racial inequalities, are attributed to structural components of societal institutions. Every interaction in society has a racial component, and implicit racism, hidden or unseen racism, exists in every interaction. Exploitation built into the systems of society are responsible for the poor performance and outcomes of different races. Cultural components have little to no impact. The challenge with critical race theory is it depends on who you talk to and whose perspective and whose definition people want to focus on when they're dialoguing about the theory. Some definitions fall more within the academic understanding that we've given you, while others tap into the destructive nature of its Marxist roots, demanding Marxist remedies for racial inequality in America. Now, I'm going to give you a whole host of definitions, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And you will also see why we spent so much time on the destructive nature of Marxism at the beginning of this podcast. So I'm going to begin with the first definition of critical race theory from Wikipedia. Some of you might laugh at that, but I want you to think about this. If somebody wants to learn about critical race theory, where do they go? Wikipedia. And they're going to read this definition. So Wikipedia says critical race theory is a cross-disciplinary intellectual and social movement of civil rights scholars and activists who seek to examine the intersection of race and law in the United States and to challenge mainstream American liberal approaches to racial justice. For example, the CRT conceptual framework is one way to study how and why U.S. courts give more lenient punishment to drug dealers from some races than to drug dealers of other races. Now, that's a very academic approach, and it's very bounded. And it's more in line with what we've talked about CRT being an analysis of the legal criminal justice system and legal system of America. But critical race theory doesn't stay bounded there. It draws heavily onto its Marxist critical theory roots and makes bold interpretive statements about America based upon its Marxist critical theorist lens. The next quote we're going to read is from Cornel West, and this comes from his foreword to Critical Race Theory, Key Writings that Formed the Movement. And he writes, critical race theory is the most exciting development in contemporary legal studies. This comprehensive movement in thought and life, created primarily, though not exclusively, by progressive intellectuals of color, compels us to confront critically the most explosive issues in American civilization. The historical centrality and complicity of law in upholding white supremacy and concomitant hierarchies of gender, class, and sexual orientation. This is critical theory that sees the institution of the American legal system as upholding and perpetuating white supremacy. And that white supremacy and exploitation and victimization then extends to hierarchies of gender, class, and sexual orientation. Once again, this is Marxist critical theory that sees the institutions of America set up based upon exploitation and victimization, namely the exploitation and victimization of racism and the ability to exploit and victimize other individuals based upon their gender, sexual orientation, and class. Notice it's the assumption of the system as corrupt. There's no room for any other factors, say cultural influences, that might be leading to disparities in outcomes for minorities or any other identity politic group. The final quote comes from Ibram X. Kendi and his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Assimilationist leaders of some socialist and communist organizations have asked people of color to leave their racial identities and anti-racist battle plans at the door, decrying identity politics. Some of these socialists and communists may not be familiar with their ideological guides' writings on race. And he quotes Karl Marx. The discovery of gold and silver in America, Karl Marx once wrote, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the aboriginal population, the beginning of a conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. Marx recognized the birth of the co-joined twins. Here, Ibram X. Kendi reaches all the way back to Marx and co-joins racism with the economic exploitation that Marx saw from the very beginning. That very economic exploitation that the original socialists of Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, amongst others, used such radical methods to attempt to eradicate from the face of the earth in an attempt to gain economic equity. Here's where I tie all of this together. Critical race theory is not simply some form of legal analysis bounded up within academia. When it translates into culture, it follows a Marxist paradigm demanding Marxist mediation for what it considers to be institutionalized racism across all aspects of the United States. And what does critical race theory demand? Critical race theory demands a defunding of the police, a change in the legal system, especially for decriminalization, and changes in sentencing and bail structures to achieve racial equity. The modern-day abolitionist movement is declaring and demanding an end to the entire system of prisons and incarceration in America. And that's just the beginning. Remember the quote that I read from Solzhenitsyn when he says that didn't the destruction of the capitalist system of oppression require the tearing apart of the legal system, the prison system, the police, the army? critical race theory would dramatically alter all of the institutions of society to achieve racial equity, completely in the spirit of Marxism from which it draws its intellectual analysis and application. Given the murderous history of Marxism, this can't be overlooked. When pressed, critical race theorists will point to definitions like Wikipedia and claim it's an academic theory that really isn't a thing. It's not out in culture. It isn't anywhere. But the reality is that it is circulating everywhere, influencing Antifa, Black Lives Matter, and it's being widely circulated by Ibram X. Kendi in all of his diversity training that he does at the likes of Google and Microsoft. This is not a benign theory that is bounded in within academia. It's loose in culture and taking on a life of its own, following its Marxist heritage and its Marxist roots, and it's firmly embedded in our public education system. I want to close by reading an article from Fox News. It's entitled, "An Elite New York City School Teaching Kindergartners About White Privilege." An elite Manhattan school is teaching white students as young as 6 that they're born racist and should feel guilty benefiting from, quote, white privilege, unquote, while heaping praise on and cupcakes on their black peers. Administrators at the Bank Street School for Children on the Upper West Side claim it's a novel approach to fighting discrimination, and that several other private New York schools are doing it, but even liberal parents aren't buying it. They complain that the K-8 school of 430 kids is separating whites in classes where they're made to feel awful about their whiteness, and all the kids of color in other rooms where they're taught to feel proud about their race and are rewarded with treats and other privileges. Ever since Ferguson, the school has been increasingly anti-white propaganda in its curriculum, said a parent who requested anonymity because she has children currently enrolled in the district. Bank Street has created a dedicated space for schools for kids of color, where they're embraced by minority instructors and encouraged to voice their feelings and share experiences about being kids of color, according to school presentation slides obtained by the Post. Meanwhile, white kids are herded into separate classrooms and taught to raise their awareness of the prevalence of whiteness and privilege, challenge notions of colorblindness and assumptions of normal, good, and American, and understand that and own that European ancestry and see their tie to privilege. This is critical race theory at work, and I think this speaks for itself. I'm going to conclude this episode of the podcast with these thoughts. Critical race theory could truly be something that could be helpful for us in America. If there is an analysis that would help us see that parts of our society were set up in ways to privilege one racial group and then to disadvantage another racial group, we need to know that, because we cannot have a society in America constructed that way. But critical race theory doesn't take an even-handed analysis. It is Marxist critical theory applied to race, assuming that each one of the institutions of America were corrupt from the very beginning with systemic racism that exists today, causing irreparable harm to minority communities everywhere, while denying that any cultural factors might have influence, especially when a long list of black intellectuals have generations of data that show that cultural factors have a tremendous amount of influence over the outcome of any individual in a minority community or white America for that fact. Lacking a balanced, evidence-based approach here, critical race theory is simply what it is. It is Marxism. It is critical theory being forced onto the American cultural scene for kids as young as 6, all the way through to the corporations at the highest levels in America. It has a Marxist history and Marxist roots. It takes a Marxist interpretation of America and has Marxist demands upon culture. Given the murderous history and destructive nature of Marxism, that cannot be overlooked. And if we choose to overlook that, we do that at our peril. Thank you once again for spending time with us here at Battleground Ideas, where faith, philosophy, and culture collide. I'm Chuck Mason, and I want to ask you to reach out to us here at the podcast. You can reach me at chuck@battlegroundideas.com. Give us your critique, give us your criticism, tell us how helpful this was, and as always, like and share. Until the next time, thank you and God bless.